Hopefully you will already have some familiarity with working with Lightwave's rigging tools and system, and you will be aware of some of the little caveats and details and optional ways of doing things that exist, as well as some of the procedural items for getting things, exactly lined up correctly, so that everything works out, produces the kind of result you're after, and so on. If you are not, consider this something of a crash course introduction. If you are so familiar, then it's probably helpful to have something of a roundup of the specific procedural issues that are going to be important when it comes to doing face rigging, to help pick those out and separate them from all of the stuff that there is to know about Lightwave's rigging system in general. First of all, we mentioned in control systems how we're going to use a lot of scaling parts, especially for the bones. One of the things we have to remember about scaling, of course, is that it doesn't just scale an item, it scales the space of that item and thus the space of any children of that item. So of course, if we scale this top bone out here on Z, everything, appears to, play nicely, that all looks lovely. But then when you rotate bones below it, you see, they remain scaled in the direction along which the parent bone has been scaled, and so they stretch and smush about as you rotate them in what is a scaled, distorted space. On the one hand, this means that we need to think carefully about hierarchies, but it also answers a question that we raised back when we were talking about the different comparisons between face rigs and body rigs, and the lack of clarity of how a hierarchy should look in a face rig. In areas where we're using scaling items, especially stretchy bones, what we're going to find are an awful lot of hierarchies of just one item, because of course we won't be able to have anything beneath them, or at least we won't be able to have chains of items beneath them that are active and we're trying to do stuff with. As a result of that, if we are wanting to inherit scaling from one item to another, then we'll find ourselves having to use constraint tricks. So for instance, my bone 2 here, we parent that off so it's no longer a child of bone 1, throw in a null, which I'll just snap to that position there, and make a child of bone 1. I can then take bone 2, constrain its rotation to the null, world and same as item on all channels, do exactly the same for the position here, and then for the scale, set its scale item as that bone 1. This then gives me something that behaves kind of like a hierarchy. Bone 2, I now rotate by, of course, rotating the null like this. But when I have to perform scaling on my bone 1, the whole thing, acts as we might hope it to. It acts as if there were no scaled space, because, of course, the fact is that there isn't. This is outside of the space. Now, of course, even though this is looking, like a normal bone hierarchy here in our viewport, I appear to have one bone that's the child of the other bone, and it's just rotated. Because it's actually not, and we are outside of the space, then of course many of the compensation deformation effects that we're used to using in body rigs to help smooth out things in certain places where bones are joined together, we cannot use, because that relies on a parent-child relationship such as we have here. That means that this sort of stuff is pretty much going to be out of the window for us. Of course, some of them we can use on single items, joint comp, muscle flex, muscle bulge. But of course, many of the backup and complementary ones, like the comp and flex and what have you for parent, that we often more commonly see on body rigs, so the forearm turns, the elbow rotates, and the parental muscle, of course, flexes to give us a bicep-like effect. We have to forgo all of that stuff throughout probably the vast majority of our rig. This, of course, will have ramifications for us, as it means we might need to employ additional hold bones or automated hold bones that respond to other things, or other kinds of displacements and deformation adjustments to make up for stuff that we cannot do here. Since we are on the subject of scaling, let's remember the other place where scaling is important on bones, and that's the fact that bones always rest as if they are at scale 1. When we add bones to a mesh, before they will affect that mesh, of course, we have to rest them in order to bind them in, but we need to rest them at scale 1. Of course, a common mistake that is made, especially by those who aren't familiar with rigging, is that they will, want to fit a bone to something, and so they'll just scale it out. But then, of course, when you get to that bone and rest it, out jumps your mesh. The reason being is that the mesh is being treated as if the bone were at scale 1 when it was rested. Obviously, that's a simple enough error to avoid when positioning your bones and setting their sizes. You quickly learn to use the rest length tool in order to size them out instead. But the important thing to keep an eye on in this whole situation that we're going to be facing is, of course, the fact that we're going to be setting up a lot of stretch bones along the way. Making sure to be careful that, as you hook them up and hook up their stretchy attributes, that the control system at base pose leaves them at scale 1 so that they rest in correctly. Or, alternatively, so that they're not squishing or producing a deformation at base pose. As such, keeping this issue in mind isn't so much a fact of just remembering not to scale the bones yourself. It's to make sure that the constraint system and the motion control that you use haven't scaled them during the setup phase, because that's a much easier thing to miss. The other thing to remember and keep in mind, of course, is how bone influence affects different parts of the mesh, how they pull, at a mesh in order to produce deformation. Of course, we have good old weight-free skinning available to us, where we don't have to set weight maps and we can use, fall-off range to determine how soft or sharp the influences from bones are. But clearly that's not going to fly for us with a face. Whilst you can on some characters get away with weight-free skinning on their bodies, for most you need, some basic separation weights. On faces you will often need to be more specific, if for no other reason because the areas of the face are so close to one another. So have a bone here for the upper lip and one for the lower lip, and clearly that's not going to work. I am going to have specific maps for specific areas. Some such thing we see here with, of course, a lip up and a lip low map for those bones there, allowing us to, mush those respective areas of mesh around like this. Of course, again, in this case I've just got the one map for the lip low, the one map for the lip up. It should be pretty obvious we're not going to want only one bone in each lip. That won't let us shape it much. But we'll find, of course, that we can still use Lightwave's fall-off weights within specified areas, so we can have multiple bones sharing the one weight map. The other weighting technique, of course, is to have weight map only set for bones, where you have explicit weights, one weight per bone. When you are doing that, the strength, of course, doesn't matter, because it's an explicit weight. The thing is with faces, although you can weight in this fashion, it's a lot more challenging than it is to do on a body. Again, if you go back to what we were seeing in the comparison of body rig versus face rig, we note how the bodies are just they're these blocks or these rods. Doing explicit weights there, whilst it may be tricky at the hinge points to get things, fully blend up nicely, the basics of it are easy enough. You've got an upper arm, a forearm, an upper leg, a lower leg. You have these very clear block unit areas. That's much less clear with a face, unless you're just going to try and grab the couple of vertices that a given bone might be spanning. It also means, of course, the reason that I'm getting this, soft, round little adjustment here at the mid-lip point, despite having explicit weights, is due to the fact that you can see there's a partial weight on the lip mid, the mouth corner position there, and we have that for both the up and the lower map. In this case it's 50% weight at each of those maps for that same location, so they share it. But if you've got a whole string of bones in an area of face, then managing these little values and the fade between values, which of course in explicit weighting is what takes the place of the strength setting here, That can be really challenging to do on a face. Of course, you might want to try it, and there might be situations where you need to do it. For instance, if you wanted to set up a boned face animation that could be exported to a game engine, you have to use explicit weights. But it is more work, and as I say, it is harder to do. It does require a lot more practice, a lot more patience and skill to achieve. So what we shall see throughout these tutorials is we will not be using a weight map only option at any point. We will use area weights, so sectioning off areas of the mesh like this, which will be affected by multiple bones. Then we can of course use fall off here if we have the need, and of course we can also attenuate using the strength parameter on a bone by bone basis if we want to just be able to, nudge how much influence a certain chunk of mesh is getting from a given bone or set of bones. We just spoke briefly back at the beginning there in scaling about, constraining things in and setting stuff up that way. Because you will have so many interconnected parts that of course have to, work together and see one another's motions. And these may be using different motion controllers, such as the IK and the constraints, or we might use nodes. You might find in your own work reasons to use other motion modifiers. You might use expressions, all of that sort of stuff. Remember, of course, in order for them to all talk to one another properly, to keep an eye on the evaluation order and the evaluation stack of motions. We already, of course, saw one instance of this issue arise one video back when we were talking about the volume preserving stretchy bone and the after IK node network for it. And of course on meshes, the subdivision order and how that plays into any displacements that we're using and how the displacement order works as well. Again, if you want to refresh on that, look to what we noted in the intro vid about the foundations chapter to the RH rigging tutorial set. There's a video there on the YouTube that will explain those details for you if you're a little rusty or not so familiar. All this talk of bones, some of you might be wondering why it is we've not so far mentioned joints. Of course, in many situations, and certainly in body rigging, we often find joints preferable as they're more flexible and they give us additional deform options that we don't get with bones. Owing to this, they are often the preferred choice. However, when it comes to face rigging, these additions are of less use. If we remind ourselves, the main things are the fact that you can have stuff like the joint compensation options, muscle flexing and so forth on multiple axes. It's not restricted just to pitch, it will work on heading as well with joints. But since we're not going to be using much in the way of hierarchies of bones in actual parent-child chains, and a lot of these options are missing for us anyway, there's little to be gained with joints. The other option that we have with joints, of course, is the twist modifier that they can have, whereby bank rotation applied at an end joint will distribute its twist down the length of the joint to the parent. Again, this is a very useful thing to have, and certainly we might want to, turn and twist bits of our mesh on the face. A good example would be when you're curling the lip. But since for the most part areas like that will have multiple bones running across them, in order to build their shape, having the ability to distribute the twist along each little bone will probably be of little importance, especially when we are using the shared weights method, or the multiple bones per weight. Multiple bones all twisting slightly different amounts will give us nice distributed twist deformation in those areas where we require it. That's not to say that you can't use joints instead should you desire. That's perfectly fine to do. However, the requirement for such in order to get a good deformation is very slim, and you're not going to get any great noticeable amount of difference with the bones or with the joints in that sense. Another thing that joints may cause us to do is forget ourselves, since of course with joints we have this ability to, grab a child and move it down, and we see there the actual deformer portion, the bone portion in the center scaling along. But as we can see from the effect on this mesh, we're not actually getting a scaling effect here. We get a visual scaling effect on the joint icons and the deformer icon, but the mesh itself is actually being translated. when it comes to doing stretchy bones and scaly ones, we would be acting in exactly the same way on joints as we would on bones, where we're actually wanting to scale the base point like this. There is, however, one place where joints come up useful that we won't have much recourse to in this training, but which you may find useful in your own characters, and that's when you have individual joints by themselves. In this case, they can still have a deformation effect without a child to create a deformer portion, provided, if we recall, that the multiply strength by rest length option is turned off for them. And the difference is that the influence, the fall off, for a singular joint is spherical, unlike a bone, which is more like a capsule fall off around its length. So of course we see here that when scaling this bone down, or scaling it up, we have this capsule ovoid area of influence around the bone, which is of course pertaining to its rest length. If that rest length is changed, then you can see it shrinks down in the one axis, but not so much the other. It's only when we get down to a point-like rest length that we start to see this circular fall-off. This same circular fall-off is of course available in joints. And yes, I know here it looks a bit like an egg. That's simply because of these other bones that are of course lending their influence since they're being shared across the mesh. So you can choose to use circular joints or point-like bones if you want an area of face to just get a, simple, spherical, rounded fall-off deformation that you want to be able to grab hold of. Something perhaps like a fat lump on the cheek, a wobbly throat or similar might benefit from the use of a single joint. But again, there's little difference if you were to use a point bone. Lastly, we may also on faces find ourselves wishing to use combinations of morphs and bones. Now you could perhaps have this in something like the combination shapes rig, where the face itself is based on morphs and shapes, and you desire to use bones for secondary shaping and shape adjustment, or you can have it, as we will see in these tutorials, where your face rig is principally based upon bones, and your use of morphs is for the secondary shaping and shape adjustment that gets done on top. What we have to remember is the way that the two play into one another. So you can see here I've just got a couple of bones in the lip, like this, that have, just fall off influence within that area. And we have morphs here, for instance, driving the opening and closing of the jaw. And what you can see is that here in the closed position, these are, fully grabbing of the mesh. They've got a nice strong influence there. And as we open the jaw using the morph, that influence is, as we can see, maintained. That's how it would look like at base with no movement in the bone, and we can see that the piece of lip there is still moving the same amount under the influence of this bone. The reason that this happens is because the bone deformation is being applied before the morph deformation. This goes back to reminding ourselves about the order in which displacements are applied to a mesh. So effectively, you should think of it that this displacement is applied, then with that shape already put into our mesh, this next displacement becomes applied, carrying that existing shape with it. This can be done differently, and here, just for simplicity, we can check the use morphed positions option for the bones, and we see that we get a different result. In this case, the morph is being applied before the bone, and what we see as a result of that is that our effect of our bone is different. It doesn't play the same way into the mesh. Of course, this causes a problem because if our bone is posed right down here, but of course we change our morph value, then we can see that we're getting more displacement from that bone and less when it comes open. This effect, of course, is also taken care of here when we're using nodes to put morph maps on, where we have the displacement order that the morphs or the nodal displacement is applied. Does it happen before bones, or is it happening at some stage after the bones? And which way round you need this to happen depends upon which rig you're building. If you are building a rig of morph shapes with secondary adjustments via bones, then you need the bones to occur before the morphs. If you are building a rig, as we will be here, that is based upon bones, and you need morphs to be your secondary shaping, then you need morphs to occur before bones. And we will see that used and how it plays out as we go through our facial rigging. Speaking of which, this whole thing now pretty much wraps up our introductory section, introducing us to the basics and need-to-knows of face rigging, and of course all of these little points about the way that Lightwave's rigging system works that you need to keep in mind. With all of that information dispensed and hopefully digested, we shall move on now in the next videos to actually rigging our faces from scratch.